Welcome to our program Hyper Annotations 2.0, organized by the New Center for Research and Practice, and I'm here with the curators of the Portuguese Pavilion. Could you introduce yourselves?
So my name is Moura.
I'm Silvia.
And we've been working as a duo since 2009, so for a long time now.
I would like to ask you about the Biennale, how it is to be here, how it is to participate in this kind of big event. How do you find it after the pandemic? And maybe also you could tell more. You are you establish an institution, Constale Lisbon, and so you knew how pandemic changed approaches to creating.
So yeah, being in Venice, in the Venice Biennale with a national pavilion, national representation, is a unique opportunity. Not so much because of the national representation part, because those ideas of nation states have been eroded over the decades, but just the ability to be able to present a really articulated, well done project, in our case by a single artist, to such a wide community of peers and audience is really a privilege to be able to present something that we've been working on for a while to such an expanded field of practitioners. So I think for me that's the most important thing, to just be able to do something that we know a lot of people will have access to.
Yeah, that means like the talking about the pandemic, and I think we can still feel a bit of some of the ideas of the pandemic in the project we're presenting here, because these vampires in space have all these issues about mental health and about this being alone and being and confronted with yourself, and this idea of you thinking about what body do you have, what are you as a person. So it's also this idea of the project reflecting a bit on that, not directly, but like thinking also of that. And in terms of curating, for us it was, so as you were saying, we founded the Constale Lisbon in 2009, and all the pillar of Constale Lisbon is about sociability. So it was really tricky for us during the pandemic here, because it's what you're aiming with that institution was not available anymore. So the idea of being together, the idea of socializing was kind of left behind, and it was, so for us it was really a struggle in the beginning. Then we found some ways of doing it, but it was a super struggle.
Yeah, what was at the core of this project, this institutional reflection, was togetherness and kinship to a certain extent, and to have 2 years in which that was considered, dangerous or literally a vector of infection, really made us question what is the role of an institution like ours under those conditions. So what happens to togetherness when you have to be isolated? What happens of being together, acting together, thinking together, the role of bodies in relation to each other as political bodies when we need to be at home isolated. So for 2 years, it was a really interesting process of reflection on those conditions. And I think this is the first edition of the Venice Biennale post-pandemic. So it's actually incredible to be here and just being able to be with people again. And especially with this project, which is a project about kinship and chosen families and just figuring out, who you are, what your body is, self-reflection. So I think to a certain extent, this is the best project we could present under these circumstances, but also in relation to the overall theme of the Biennale. So this complete reconfiguration of what the human is, like what does it mean to be human? What are the possibilities for being human? What can we imagine as a human body or mind in this day and age under all the conditions that we're thrown against. So I think this is just the perfect project for us.
Yeah, and imagination has been always like a really important tool for us in terms of working, in terms of thinking about creators. So imagination is always this idea that you can think of something else, that you can imagine a future, and the future is something that it doesn't exist, so we have to create your own future as a community. So it's also these ideas that are there.
And it's really interesting because both our curatorial practice and, as João was mentioning, this idea of imagination as a tool from which we can produce a future finds its way into this project, which is about the future. Again, imagining this future through the tropes of sci-fi. Of course, these vampires are traveling through space in the spaceship in search of a twin planet from Earth. So I think imagination is a very powerful tool for us to imagine and produce a future otherwise.
Actually, I would like to ask you how institutions can or are able to construct this future for the art world, for artists, relating to the pandemic experience, of course, and what you said about the imagination.
I think institutions have a fundamental role in the way the world is produced. Institutions define how we interact with each other under many different fields of activity. Like a hospital defines what's health and what's disease. A school defines what's knowledge. The prison defines what's crime. So institutions have this ability of produce society in which we live. So in our case, within the contemporary art world, I think imagining an institution means trying to imagine other relations between us and the artwork, between the artist and the audience, in a way that is more ethical, more aware of the context in which it exists, more aware of the audience and how that mediation happens. Just being mindful, aware, and knowledgeable of all these conditions, and not only replicating them, but making the critique of those conditions and trying to change them. Of course, this doesn't happen overnight, and this doesn't happen instantly, but it is a cumulative process. Day after day, year after year, exhibition after exhibition, we slowly can change these relations. And I think in the long run, we can produce a better, more equitable world.
In the statement of Kunsthalle Lisbon, you use this term radical hospitality. So, would you like to refer to that?
Radical hospitality for us is it's also a cliche in a way that southern countries, everyone is known by this sociability, and for us it was really important as an institution to think about what relationship can you create with the artist, with the audience, with the peers. So for us it was this also bringing people together and bringing people together in a way that I'm using family as an example, but the word is not family, but that the institution takes care of the artist. It's not only like showing someone and then we don't know, they don't matter anymore, like keeping this relation growing, keep this relation developing. So you can do an exhibition now, and the next year you can do a book, or just call that people, or just invite it again to Lisbon. So it's this kind of maintenance of the relation that is also important for us. And as Luis was saying about this idea of the ethics of the institution, and how can you change that ethics? How can you change that relation with your peers, with your audience? So it's, of course, it's a small-scale institution that allows you to think about all these issues. Yeah.
I think when we thought of radical hospitality, we were thinking provocatively, as always, as a teaser and just a way of inviting people to think with us about these issues. But at the same time, we wanted to place at the core of the institution not production, not the idea of producing how many shows or producing how many books or public programs. That isn't the core of the institution. The core of the institution is a series of relationships that we establish with everyone, whether artists, whether the audience, whether the politicians and the funding bodies. So what the institution actually is this ever-expanding set of relationships that are based on radical hospitality, this just giving, and not giving because you want something in return, just giving as a political gesture. And those relationships for us can be understood better through the notion of friendship. So what radical hospitality produces under the institutional framework of our project is friendship. So the product of the institution, what Kunsthalle Lissabon produces, is friendship. And I think that from an ethical point of view and from an institutional point of view, that is really something that I find relevant and kind of allows us to shift the way institutions are perceived. And then from that, of course, there needs to be a public output because you don't see relationships publicly, But the core of that radical hospitality lies in those relationships.
Do you find Pedro's work with more pessimistic or optimistic approach to the future? Because we are also trying to meditate on the idea of exhaustion, but also on the idea of re-enchantment. I would be very happy if you could tell us more about those concepts.
So say more optimistic or pessimistic? I would say more humanistic in a way.
It's funny because I don't think it's an either-or situation. I think, like the films and like the project, it's a balance. And of course, there are moments in which you feel more optimistic, and there are moments you feel less optimistic. So it's about a balance. It's about, sometimes you think that the future will be grim, and sometimes you think the future will be great. And I think Pedro's practice balances on that kind of thread. And sometimes it is one thing, and at times it is another, and at times it's both. Because, I think, and this is another thing that we've been trying to do over the years in our curatorial practice, and I think this is a great example, and I think your question is great because it made me think of that as well, is that we try to refuse binaries. It's not either or. They're not mutually exclusive. The future can be both. The future can be many, many things because it doesn't exist. It's up to us to produce it. So if we're committed to a better future for all of us, then we'll work towards that. If we're just interested in a future which is just good for the two of us, then it will be terrible for a lot of people. So it's a balance. And of course, it is individual, but it's also communal. It is all and nothing at the same time.
I would like to ask one more question about the art scene in Portugal. Why did you decide to establish an institution in Lisbon?
Portugal is a small country, but I think in terms of the art scene, it's quite active. Of course, you suffer with these last 3 years of COVID, but I think being a small art scene is quite dynamic in this. So you have Lisbon and Porto as the main centers, but then there's some pop-up cities that are doing some really, really nice projects around. But institutional-wise, is not the best in the world, but at some really good institutions. They're thinking about what is an institution and the artists they are showing. But in terms of artists, I think there's a genre of artists that is super diverse, and you can find like really good narratives around the works of the artists, and can have some really nice dialogues with the artists. So I would say that the art scene is quite good in a way, if good is the word, but yeah.
Just following on what João said about the institutional landscape. Yeah, the reason why we decided, and that this was many years ago, we were young curators back then. The reason why we decided to just create our own institution was because we were very dissatisfied with the institutional landscape in the country. And for us, who despite being young, represented a new generation of curators who were educated in curating, who were mobile, who had connections throughout the world with peers, we felt that the discourse in the country, the curatorial discourse and the institutional discourse, were lacking. And of course, as young curators, you take things into your own hands, and you do it because no one else is doing it. And I think that was it. And we wanted to make the most of that energy, of that kind of really exciting energy that was going on in Lisbon, but also making the most out of, our knowledge, our expertise, our connections to the world, and bringing that to Lisbon on one hand, but also using those connections to be in the world. Because I think that was what we felt, is that we felt that we should be in and of the world. And the reason why we created Kunsthal Lisbon was just because of that. We wanted to interact, we wanted the dialogue, we wanted the exchange. So that was it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you.